Okay, I'm gonna prop up the back of my iPad here just a little bit.
Sure. Looks like we are live. People will be joining us in a minute. It takes a few seconds here. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another meeting of the First Tuesday Conservatives, broadcast both on the First Tuesday Conservatives Facebook page and also through Alpha News, a partner of First Tuesday Conservatives. My name is Kyle Hooten. Today we're joined by Trent England, who is with the Save Our States project. He's going to talk to us a little bit about why the Electoral College is important, what threats it's facing, and I think this is going to be a very timely discussion, given the looming 2020 election and all the concerns around voting that we've seen there. Trent, thanks for being with us.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
So first off, I don't think many people know what Save Our States is, at least not in this group. Could you just sort of explain your work and what you do there?
Yeah, so back in 2007, 2008, I was working on kind of two different things. I was working on election security in Washington State, and I was also doing some work on constitutional federalism. My background is as an attorney working on public policy. And these things come together in this fight over the Electoral College. And there was an effort launched to try to get rid of the Electoral College in 2006. I created Save Our States in 2009 to make the case for the Electoral College, why it matters, and to help try to stop this effort to basically get rid of it.
Sure. So I think a lot of people are familiar with the term Electoral College, and they broadly understand that it's a way to divide votes based on states. Could you sort of flesh out what exactly it is and why it's important for us?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. I mean, because there's this tendency not to really, and it makes sense, to not really focus on the details of something that works really well. And the Electoral College has sort of worked in the background, up until 2000. 2000, people started paying attention. They said, what is this thing? And obviously 2016, even more so, and it's become a topic of debate. But the Electoral College is a two-step democratic process. And that's really important to understand, because in that way, it is not at all unusual when you compare us with other countries around the world. Large democratic nations tend to use a two-step process to elect their head of government, prime minister or president. The Electoral College says to each state, you have as many electoral votes as you have members of Congress. That's the House and the Senate. So the smallest states get at least 3 electoral votes for president. Bigger states get more based on having more House seats. And when we go and vote for president in November, we're really casting a ballot for our state's electors to determine whether our state is going to choose Republican electors who will vote for Donald Trump or Democrat electors who will vote for Joe Biden.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So you use this term two-step versus one-step. I assume that a one-step process would just be direct democracy, total up the votes, whoever gets the most votes wins.
Yeah, that's right. It'd be the system that they use, for example, in say France or Mexico.
Sure. So why did the founding fathers choose to go with the two-step versus the one-step? I've actually never been clear on that myself.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because there's sort of a lot of revisionist history out there about why this happened. One of the most important things to know is when they all showed up at the Constitutional Convention, the rough draft, the original idea was to have Congress choose the president. That was the original idea. It was in the Virginia plan. And, like I say, right, that would be basically a parliamentary system. I mean, that is how things are done in many places around the world. And the founders didn't want that system. It was interesting. I mean, it was sort of what they knew. They were familiar with it. It was like the default, but nobody was happy with it. And as you read these debates, you realize that nobody liked it because they didn't want Congress to control the president. They wanted to have an independent president. They wanted these separate branches that could check and balance each other. So they started looking around at other systems. They talked about a direct election. But the problem was, and James Madison actually just comes out and says this very plainly, that the biggest states, the biggest population centers would just control everything, right? They would control the executive branch. Mm-hmm. And Madison points out that one of the problems with that, in any given election, you might have some places that have more sway than others, but Madison says the big population centers don't change. At least they don't change very fast. And it's interesting. He names Virginia and New York. And of course, Virginia is still a fairly big state, but New York is still one of the biggest states. And it was, 240 years ago. So Madison was right. So Madison says, look, we need some kind of a compromise between this parliamentary system and a direct election system. And they get down to the wire. They get down to the very last committee to resolve. Each state that was there provides a delegate to the committee. Madison represents Virginia, and they're going to resolve the final issues. This was one of those final issues, and Madison basically comes up with this plan. It had been talked about a little bit before to have some kind of an electoral system, but Madison writes it up, and that becomes our constitutional system, with one change, which is the 12th Amendment in 1804 made it so that the runner-up doesn't become vice president. Originally, the runner-up became vice president. People who've seen the musical Hamilton know that didn't turn out well.
Yeah, of course. So is this unique then, that what Madison drafted and this system that was put into place in America, or is this seen in other countries?
Yeah, so in its detail, it's unique. But in its sort of broad strokes, it's not unique. Germany has a kind of an electoral college, and Germany has a very rich history of federalism, like we have. And so Germany uses a kind of an electoral college. It's much more complicated than ours. And India has what they actually call an electoral college, which is also much more complicated than ours. I mean, you go Google these things, and it's a little mind blowing. And then you have all the other the parliamentary systems where it's a two-step democratic process, but it has it's even more indirect, because presidential electors under our Constitution just, they exist only to vote for president. That's all they do. And so, they vote for president and then poof, they're gone. And of course, if you're voting for a member of parliament, there's a lot more that you're voting on than just who they're going to elect as prime minister. So that makes that system more direct. But yeah, we're really not as much of an outlier, I find, as a lot of people sort of think, or as the media tries to portray.
Yeah, I've heard dozens of pundits over the years trying to say the Electoral College is some sort of, uniquely corrupt system or some American atrocity against democracy. It makes it sound like it's not actually the case.
Yeah.
You talk about these electors. Who are they and how do they get chosen?
Yes. So in most states, the political parties have a convention at some point in the spring, and they nominate people to be their party's electors. So, here in Oklahoma, where I live, the Oklahoma Republican Party had a convention, and they nominated a slate of 7 people to be their, the Republican presidential electors. Democrats did the same thing. I think the Libertarians are on the ballot here this year, so they did the same thing. And, they're real candidates for office in a legal sense. If you look into state law, those people are nominated by their political party. They are running for the office of presidential elector. And, if Donald Trump gets the most votes in Oklahoma, those 7 people who the Republican Party nominated will become Oklahoma's presidential electors. And then in December, they'll meet in Oklahoma City at the state capitol, and they will officially cast Oklahoma's presidential electoral votes, which then go to Congress and get open when Congress begins in early January.
Back in 2016, I'd heard some talk about these electors going rogue or not voting with the will of their state. Is that something that's ever happened historically?
So every once in a while, you get some electors who vote for somebody unexpected. There are kind of some anomalies. There was a time in the 19th century when a vice presidential candidate died. And so there's a whole bunch of electors who voted for somebody else, but that was, the party was actually working that out. It's part of the flexibility that the Electoral College creates. In almost every case, when you have a so-called faithless elector, it's somebody on the losing side who's trying to send a message. And that's, 2016 was a little bit unique because you had some electors on the losing side who they were saying, well, maybe if instead of voting for Hillary Clinton, we vote for John Kasich, then we can get Republican electors to vote for John Kasich, and we can throw the election to the House of Representatives. And, it didn't. There was one Republican elector from Texas who voted for somebody other than Donald Trump. This had no effect, other than it went to the Supreme Court. And in July, the Supreme Court decided a case on whether states could have laws that say presidential electors must vote for the person they're expected to vote for. Some of the electors were from Washington State. Washington State fines them $1,000 if they do that, and that law was upheld. Some of the electors were from Colorado. Colorado actually says, if you go in and you try to vote for somebody else, these electors were supposed to vote for Hillary Clinton. They went in, they tried to vote for somebody else. They actually get automatically rejected. Their vote is rejected. They get replaced by an alternate. And so those votes don't even count as faithless electors. And that law was also upheld. So at this point, the whole faithless elector issue, the Supreme Court has kind of put it to bed. Some of the states that don't have those laws are now taking action to pass those laws and just, give people a little more assurance of how the system will work.
Interesting. I was not aware that the Supreme Court had ruled on that. So do you think that most states in coming times will have laws against faithless electors?
Yeah, most states have some kind of a law against faithless electors right now, although some of them don't have a sanction. I do think now that the Supreme Court has ruled in these cases, I think probably almost every state is going to pass a law like this.
That's very interesting. So it looks like legally, this process is becoming more sound and more established, yet in the media and in public discourse, we hear people talking badly about the system just absolutely all the time. What is your response to people that say that direct democracy would be more faithful to the will of the people?
Yeah, I think that at the highest level, the response is that when we're thinking about a government, a constitution, we always have to decide what our highest objective is, right? There's a hierarchy of values. People like that idea. And from the perspective of the American founders, democracy is an important mechanism, but it's a mechanism. It's a process. It's a way to register the consent of the people, for the people to exercise a check on elected officials, for us to generate representation, but it's not the ultimate purpose of government. That actually was more the French Revolution that basically said, the purpose of government is to figure out what the people want and then give it to them good and hard. The American founders said, look, justice or individual rights, that's the highest purpose of government. And so if you have a system like the Electoral College that tends to shape democratic majorities over time to be more willing to listen to minority interests, more willing to focus on people outside of the big population centers, then if that system is actually serving the higher cause of justice, it's a better democratic system than a democratic system that may be more direct, but may actually fulfill less of that higher purpose. And a great example is the French system. The French have a more direct system. It's a direct election. They have an election and then they have a runoff if no one gets a high enough percentage. And what you see in a system like that, and Mexico is like this, Russia's like this, but they don't really count. Those elections are probably not honest. Yeah, but in France, the first election in their last round of general elections, Emmanuel Macron got 23%, Marine Le Pen got 21%. And so these two candidates who together had the support of 44% of the French electorate become the only choices. And there were hundreds of thousands of French voters who actually went to the polls in the second round and cast a blank ballot in protest, right? It's not like they just sat at home and said, I'm not going to vote. They actually said, I'm going to go vote and show them, show the powers that be how much I don't like the direct democratic system, because it's not, the problem, any election system that produces one winner, it's a challenge to get everybody or even a majority of people behind that person. Our system tends to produce, these big coalition political parties that actually turn out to be much more representative than you get in a more direct system.
I really like something you brought up in there about the purpose of democracy in America. It's a mechanism to achieve the end, but not the end itself. That's something that's lost on a lot of people. That's very insightful, because if you were to abolish the Electoral College, if I'm understanding you correctly, you would have a candidate that the vast majority of people agree on, but it would be much easier for that candidate to railroad states that are out of the way, places that aren't the coasts or Chicago, and those people's values and wills would not be represented in government, correct?
That's absolutely right. I mean, there are 10 million people who live in the county of Los Angeles, right? So one county in one state 10 million people. I mean, I think there are 9 states that have a bigger population than LA County. I used to live in LA County, so I always use that as my example. I mean, yeah, you just think about a system like that. So many people, a lot of Americans right now feel like their voices aren't heard.
Mm-hmm.
A system that makes even more people feel like their voices aren't heard just probably isn't a better system.
Right. And what do you predict would happen if we were to abolish the Electoral College and turn it over to only the population centers? How do you think that would impact, the future of America politically?
Well, I think you would see a shift in politics to the left. I mean, one of the interesting dynamics, you have Democratic Party dynamics and Republican Party dynamics in this current fight. And I should point out that the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which is the campaign to hijack the Electoral College to force it to rubber stamp the direct election result, that would have no runoff. So you could win with a very small percentage of the vote. And in that kind of a system, I think the Democratic Party would move very far to the left because, as you say, that there are a lot of votes that you can pump out of urban centers. There's always a question when you have a big city with lots of people. That means there's sort of lots of potential for election fraud, right? There's just it is not to say anything bad about big cities, but if you have a county with 1,000 people and a city with 10 million people, obviously there's a lot more you can do with voter fraud when you have a lot more people, right? I think that would pull the Democratic Party to the left. I think the Republican Party would get sucked more into the suburbs and become less responsive to small towns and rural voters. But I also think that you would probably see a breakdown of the two-party system because spoiler candidates, splinter parties would have this great opportunity, probably not to win, but to play kingmaker, to protest and say, if you are running on, some, you're going to protect the Second Amendment even better than the Republicans, or you're even more pro-abortion than the Democrats. Well, you can go out and say, well, we're going to peel off some votes if they don't do what we want. If you're a Michael Bloomberg and you have billions of dollars you can spend on a campaign, you don't have to go to the Democratic or Republican parties and say, well, let me try to buy your coalition. You can go out and run on your own, and there's probably a lot of breakdown and fragmentation and balkanization that would happen without the Electoral College.
It's kind of a paradox, but it's very interesting that if you move to the direct democracy, you're going to actually have a less democratic system. I really like that point you brought up about how the left could move much further left because there's now absolutely no incentive to include voters in, so-called flyover states. A voter in Wyoming is completely irrelevant. So now the left can go as far left as they want to, and the best that the right could ever do would be to move into the suburbs and try to pick up those votes. That's a very interesting point.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that we're going to see now that, and we've already seen this, I mean, there are some issues that the Democrats are not really going to talk about. Right. And I think one of the ones I like to, I'm a conservative guy, but I like to read what people write on the left because it's sometimes it's easier to see things through their eyes. And one of the big frustrations of a lot of people on the left is that the Democratic Party is not strong enough on gun control, right? That they are not willing to take a sort of Australia position that the Second Amendment should be abolished and guns should be confiscated. But why can't they do that? Because they have to win Pennsylvania, they have to win Wisconsin and Michigan, right? Yeah. And now they're trying to win Arizona. I mean, they would have no chance if they took that position. And I think actually that's part of what motivates some people on the left to want to get rid of the Electoral College. It moderates their political party. I think that the Democrats are actually healthier with the Electoral College. I think American politics is healthier with it, and I think the Republicans are too.
So I've got two burning questions on my mind here. The first one, how do you respond to people that claim that you're supporting the Electoral College only for partisan reasons? How do you respond to people that say, oh, you only want the Electoral College because you're a Republican? The real will of the people is the progressivism. What's the answer?
Well, so I think there are two answers to the question. I mean, I'll give you my personal answer first. I've been fascinated with the Electoral College since the 1990s.
Yeah.
And I, obviously I started working on this before 2016, but after the 2000 election. And, the reality is this is a system, especially in a very close election. I would say 2000 and 2004 were, you had these extremely close elections where it could really benefit either party. Al Gore actually had some of his campaign attorneys write a memo supporting the Electoral College before the 2000 election because they thought that that one potential outcome was that Gore would lose the popular vote, win the Electoral College. And, it easily could have happened in 2004, really, potentially going in either direction. I think anybody who is trying to manipulate this system for partisan reasons is missing the big picture, which is that you change this, like we were just talking about, the whole party structure changes. What it means to be a Democrat, what it means to be a Republican, all that changes. But I think the other reality that's important to point out, there are a lot of Democrats who support the Electoral College. There are some Republicans on the other side, which is one reason I kind of like working on this issue. It's a little bit less partisan, not as much after 2016. JFK was a huge defender of the Electoral College and helped to stop an effort in the 1950s when he was in the Senate to pass a constitutional amendment to sort of water it down. Vernon Jordan, who was an attorney for Bill Clinton back in the 1970s when he was a civil rights leader and ran the Urban League, Vernon Jordan was instrumental in defending the Electoral College, pointing out that it actually gave Black voters a lot more power within the Democratic Party coalition because the Democrats could only win certain states if they had strong Black support.
Yeah.
So, I love this issue because I don't think it's really obvious in the long run who it benefits, other than that I think it benefits all of us because it promotes stability and people being listened to in our political system.
Yeah, I agree with you. I definitely agree. The second question I have, people talk about abolishing the Electoral College, just like they talk about abolishing police and everything else nowadays. But how would that actually occur? Is there some sort of legal switch they can flip to just turn it off?
Well, for a long time, there's been this focus, people who don't like the Electoral College, on amending the Constitution. Sure. And after 2000, 3 law professors came up with this very clever idea. And, you've got to give them a lot of credit. They went to the Constitution. They read Article 2, Section 1, and they came up with something that the American founders never really thought about. I tell people, and I think this is true, it's an idea so dumb that the American founders never worried about it. Yeah. And that is to get states to pass a law, because state legislatures control how their state appoints electors. And states they've just said, we're going to hold an election. That's what all states do. Well, if they can get states to pass a law that says, instead of electing our presidential electors based on the state vote, we're going to choose our presidential electors based on the national vote. So if Oklahoma passed a law like this, then this November, after Election Day, Oklahoma's Secretary of State wouldn't look at the vote outcome in Oklahoma, but he would look at the vote outcome nationwide and try to collect all of the vote totals from every state, and then say, Oklahoma might go for Donald Trump by, 65%, right? Probably will. But if the country goes for Joe Biden by 2%, and, frankly, if the country goes for Joe Biden by 2%, the difference will probably be entirely California. But Oklahoma's Secretary of State, if this was the law, would ignore what Oklahomans want and choose the Democratic electors to cast all of Oklahoma's electoral votes for Hillary Clinton.
And is that legal at the state level?
Well, they've passed this law in 15 states. They have 196 electoral votes committed to this national popular vote plan, but it only takes effect. So you have all these states that have passed it, but it only takes effect if they get enough states that they control at least 270 electoral votes, in which case it's a majority, game over. They hijack the Electoral College and turn it into a direct election system. They sort of turn it into like a zombie Electoral College where it just rubber stamps the popular vote. Is it legal? Well, one problem that we have is we can't sue because we don't have standing, because these laws they're on the books in the states that have passed this, but they haven't taken effect yet. So you don't have standing to sue until they take effect, which is a big problem because, basically what that means is you have to wait until the other side wins a big political victory before you can even go to court and say this is a bad idea. I think it is unconstitutional. I'm not sure a court would strike it down because courts can be very squeamish about getting into these political election rule disputes. Although there was, I will say, in Justice Kagan's decision in the faithless electors case last month that we were talking about at the beginning, Justice Kagan said several things that suggest that she might be willing to strike this down. So I was kind of heartened by that. But the bottom line is the best way to stop the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact is to stop state legislatures from passing it or get it repealed in states where they've done that. And that's really, Save Our States is focused almost entirely on that. We've kind of tapped some of the brightest legal minds out there to put together a litigation strategy if we need that. But we think that we can defeat it. We've stopped it in a lot of state legislatures, and we're going to keep working at it.
So worst case scenario for the Electoral College, what's the fewest number of states that need to join this compact before it controls 270?
Well, I mean, you could have the compact take effect with just a dozen states if it was all of the very biggest states.
Right.
Texas is not going to join. We've made sure of that. Florida is probably not going to join this compact. But they do have, one of the reasons that they're already at 196, they have New York, they have California, they have Illinois. If they pass this in another 7 states, by kind of my calculating, 7 of the states that we worry about, they could definitely put this into effect before 2024 and totally change the landscape of American politics.
Yeah, it'd be a lot of those changes that we talked about earlier. So when it comes to sort of resisting that change at the state level, what is your group doing?
So we do a lot of things. We go out, we meet, well, nowadays it's mostly on Zoom, but we meet with state legislators. We met last week with, I think, about 25 state legislators on Zoom during the week. So we're always talking with state legislators. Obviously, we talk with groups like the First Tuesday Conservatives, because you guys have a lot of influence with state legislators, and we want the people who influence, obviously, those legislators to know about this and to know why this is so important. And then we're engaged in sort of broader public education. We actually have a feature-length documentary that's coming out on September 8th called Safeguard, and it tells the story, not just the story of the Electoral College, but it gets into that question of democracy versus justice and minority rights. And I'm really excited about it because I think it's going to tap into some of the discussions that people are having right now about minority rights and help people understand, hey, look, we actually have a constitution that's designed to protect minority rights. And people may have their issues with police tactics and things like that, but we should all be thankful that we have a constitution that doesn't just say, hey, 50% plus one, and you can mow down the whatever minority you don't like. That's not how our system works, and part of that's the Electoral College. So you can tell I'm really excited about that. It's really good. We have a filmmaking team that was involved in the film Clinton Cash and Hillary the movie. These are some very sophisticated filmmakers from New York City who have done a great job for us telling that story. So. We're all over the place, and really excited to work with people like this group and the folks who are watching us, because this is an issue in my experience where constituents make a huge difference.
Really?
Right. Well, because I've worked on lots of state policy issues, and you get on a lot of these things, right? Taxes, and politicians. Most of them, they either ran saying, I love taxes or I hate taxes, right? And so you go to lobby an elected official on taxes, and they basically already said where they're going to stand. And a lot of the issues are like that. On this, most of your state legislators have never taken a position. A lot of them have never heard of this. And if my favorite tactic to work with a state legislator is to be a resource. Right? Be somebody who knows more than they do, not to lord it over them, but to help them And if you go to them and say, hey, there's this campaign out there, it's called National Popular Vote, I think it's really dangerous, and you know a lot more than they do about all of this, you can have a huge influence. And frankly, that's how we've stopped this in so many states. The other side has expensive paid lobbyists. We'll have a group of 8 or 10 or 12 or 20 citizens, and they'll just grind this to a halt because of some phone calls and some meetings.
That's very true. When I was younger, I interned in a state Senate office, and sometimes we would get emails or visitors of just constituents that knew a ton about a very specific issue. And I watched those people have a reasonable amount of effect. It was almost like those people were lobbyists if they knew enough about an issue to present a compelling case that a legislator might not already know a lot about. It's a very good point.
Yeah. And on this also, don't write off. I know sometimes I'll work with conservatives and they'll say, well, my legislator is way out on the left. I have some legislators who are way out on the left. I agree with them on nothing except this issue. There are still some JFK Democrats who care about the Constitution, some Vernon Jordan Democrats who understand how this protects minority rights. There was a legislator in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania 10 years ago when I was there. And he actually, I ran into him in the hall. I wasn't planning on talking to him, frankly. I knew he was a very partisan Democrat. And we got into a conversation about this. And I was thinking, oh, no, this guy's going to be totally on the other side. And he said, if people would just read the Federalist Papers, they wouldn't make these mistakes. And wow, if we had more Republicans like that, we'd be better off, right? So don't write anybody off on this issue. Most of the time, it's actually a fun thing to talk to state legislators about.
Because any Democrat that doesn't want to become an AOC or an Ilhan Omar style progressive should be in favor of this plan.
Absolutely. That is absolutely right.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Another question I have for you, you mentioned sort of at the beginning of the interview that you had some experience with election security. And just given that I'm talking to a guy that knows a lot about elections, I have to ask, what are your concerns with the 2020 election? How would mail-in voting impact things? What are your thoughts more generally?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I'll start with the Electoral College tie-in and then work my way from there. One effect of the Electoral College is that it uses state lines like the watertight compartments on an ocean liner, so that if you have fraud or even just poor election administration in one state, it at least is contained in that state and it doesn't spill out and sink the whole thing. But more broadly than that, I think that we are losing. I'm not a progressive, but we have made a lot of progress in how we run elections in the United States, right? We got to a point where people were voting in a controlled environment, in secrecy, in a way that was if not secure, it could be secured, right? You can run elections in a verifiably secure and honest way when you have polling places, in-person voting, and we are making this incredible regress, right, away from all of this progress, where all of a sudden we're getting back to, as someone who studied the 19th century, right? Ballot harvesting is nothing new. You used to have party machines that would go around and, if they weren't just making up ballots and stuffing ballot boxes, they were going to people and saying, well, you're going to cast this ballot here in this pub and we're going to watch you and we're going to see how you do it and you better do it our way. It's just weird to watch these debates. People have no imagination or no knowledge of history.
Yeah.
We may have a secure election in 2020, but if we do, it'll be luck. And we're creating an environment where fraud is inevitable because there's always bad actors. There's bad actors on both sides in both parties. The last thing we want is to become a country where we really can't trust our system, at really any level. That's the end. It's the end of the Constitution. It's the end of a functioning republic.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. You make a really good point with the fact that the Electoral College helps to contain voter fraud. And I've read a lot about voter fraud in large cities. And if there was no Electoral College, voter fraud in LA or New York City or Chicago spills over, and suddenly that's voter fraud on the national level. That's a huge problem.
Yeah, it is a huge problem. And it's particularly a problem under this interstate compact because states would have, there's no way to referee that. I mean, I will say, if they ever, threw out the Electoral College by constitutional amendment, you would probably have a federal takeover of elections, which I think would be terrible. But at least you would know how disputes are going to be resolved. This National Popular Vote Compact just says nothing about it. Basically leaves it all up to federal judges, which you can only imagine how bad that would be.
That's a good point. It's not only negligent, or it's not only damaging, but it's negligent. If you were actually to abolish the Electoral College and replace it with something else, at least there would be rules. This is just sort of throwing caution to the wind and hoping something evolves comparable to our current system.
That's right. I'm gonna borrow that term. I really like that. I haven't called it negligent before, but that is exactly right. And actually, I mentioned those 3 law professors who came up with this. One of those law professors has never gotten on board with the campaign. He came up with the idea, but he basically says that same thing. He says, look, for this to work, you would have to figure out those issues first. And so he's concerned that his own idea, now that it's been turned into a campaign and this state law mechanism, he's concerned that it would actually crash and burn.
And those 3 individuals, they're still alive, correct? You came up with this idea?
Yeah, so the law professors who are best known, Akil Rita-Mar and Vika Mar, are brothers, very smart law professors on the political left, and Vika Mar is the one who's very open about criticizing, or I give these guys lots of credit. They're very smart. I don't agree with them, but Vika Mar has been honest enough to say he helped come up with this idea, but the way that it's been turned into policy, he thinks would be dangerous.
That's very interesting. One thing we like to do here on the show is take questions and respond to comments. So, if you're watching, please feel free to type in questions or comments. It looks like we have one right now. John says, I'd like to see more states allocate electoral votes by congressional district, except for the 2 Senate winners in each state going to the statewide winner. Create some incentive for presidential campaigns to not just pay attention to the battleground states. What's your response to that?
Yeah, so that's how Maine and Nebraska, I'm sure the questioner knows it, but just for everybody else, that's how Maine and Nebraska do it. They break them up by congressional district, and there's 2 left over that go statewide. That is a really good system for some states, and it works really well in Maine and Nebraska. In states that are really, really gerrymandered, which is most big states, you wouldn't necessarily get the same effect because you may not really have swing congressional districts, which is obviously a whole different topic for another day. But, and you have these partisan distortions. I mean, the reason why Thomas Jefferson came up with winner take all is because he wanted to maximize the political power of Virginia. Now, he wanted to maximize the political power of Virginia to vote for him. Right. But the winner take all system does have that effect. So it unfortunately, it's one of these things. It kind of cuts both ways. I wish that some states would do that, but it doesn't make sense for every state.
Sure. Looks like we're getting a bit short on time here. So before you go, I want to hear where can viewers view that documentary that you were talking about earlier when it comes out?
Yeah, so the best way to find out about it is to go to our website, which is saveourstates.com. And at saveourstates.com, you can sign up for our email list, and then you will be notified. It's going to be on iTunes. It's going to be on Amazon. Excuse me. But if you want to know as soon as those things are released, you go to saveourstates.com, sign up, or go to our Facebook page, which is Save Our States, and you can get notifications there. But yeah, I'd love to. I'd love for people to watch it and review it, and let other people know they should watch it. Share it on social media. This is a really good opportunity. I mentioned that it's a good thing to talk to state legislators about. It's a great way to talk to young people, neighbors, family members, not about, political parties and Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden and all this, but just to talk about the Constitution in our states and why things are set up this way and why maybe we should think more about justice and protecting individual rights than just the mechanics of democracy and trying to have a more directly democratic system. I find that people get pretty interested in that, and that's what the film tries to do.
And gosh, it's not often these days that you get to have a conversation about a more mild political issue. It's not abortion. It's not BLM. it's a constitutional issue that people can have a intellectual discussion about, and it's been absolutely wonderful talking about this with you tonight. Is there anything else that you'd add as we're kind of coming to the closure of this meeting?
Well, you know, if people are fans of Alexander Hamilton had one of the best lines about the Electoral College in the Federalist Papers he wrote. He said, "If it be not perfect, it is at least excellent." So that's Hamilton on the Electoral College.
Absolutely. Well, I know that I've learned a lot. I hope our viewers have as well. Thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
See ya.